In today's video, we're breaking down Bhayshul Tuten out of Virginia Tech. What are strengths and weaknesses? How is he best utilized? Where do we think he goes in the NFL draft? And finally, what do we think we can expect from him in fantasy? Watch to the end of this video and we'll have a good idea. In terms of his height and weight, he's listed as 5'11", 209 pounds. The height, I think, is pretty accurate. The weight, it wouldn't shock me if he was a little bit lighter, to be honest with you. He just isn't the bulkiest guy. And he's 21 years and 9 months old right now. He is a senior. And so while we obviously would like and prefer every prospect theoretically to be an early declare because younger, there isn't as much correlation with running back success and being an early declare as there is with being a wide receiver specifically. So in my opinion, it isn't really the biggest deal. It just makes him a little bit older. And so he's going to be 22 years old as a rookie. In terms of his production, his first 2 collegiate seasons were spent at NCA&T before transferring to Virginia Tech. As a true freshman, he really didn't do very much. On 34 attempts, he had 189 rushing yards, 5.6 per pop with 2 touchdowns and no fumbles. And then 9 of 12 targets secured for 224 receiving yards and 1 receiving touchdown. Not incredible production. He did step it up in a big way as a sophomore, though, going from 34 to 208 attempts, 189 to 1,370 rushing yards, 5.6 to 6.6 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns to 13, still no collegiate fumbles. And then in a big way, stepping up in terms of passing game utilization, going from 12 to 40 targets, 9 to 30 receptions, maintaining a 75% reception percentage, while going from 224 receiving yards to 333, and 1 to 4 receiving touchdowns. Now, he did transfer in his true junior season to Virginia Tech. He wasn't quite as effective initially, and so on 175 rush attempts, he had 875 rushing yards. And he did see a career low in yards per attempt with only 5.0, but he did have 10 rushing touchdowns, however, 5 fumbles. And so that is interesting that he went from no career fumbles through his first 2 collegiate seasons, albeit with limited usage in his first season especially, to 5. That is something to worry about with his profile. But in terms of his passing game utilization, he was still effective. On 39 targets, he had 25 receptions for 64% reception percentage, 227 receiving yards, 9.1 yards per reception, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Then, as a true senior, he really stepped it up once again. On 183 rush attempts, he had 1,150 rushing yards, upped his yards per attempt from 5 to 6.3, had 15 rushing touchdowns, which was a career high, albeit with 4 fumbles, and so that's 9 in the past 2 collegiate seasons. That is a high number and is something to worry about. And interestingly enough, while he still had 27 targets and 23 receptions with an 85.2 reception percentage, he only had 81 receiving yards this year, and that's a measly 3.5 yards per reception with 2 receiving touchdowns. That is quite interesting. But nonetheless, we've seen through 3 of 4 collegiate seasons that he's an effective catcher of the football, at least in terms of his yards per reception goes. And so overall, this profile isn't the best in terms of progressive growth each and every season, but we did see some high upside seasons in terms of total utilization on the ground and in the air, and especially in touchdown scoring. Looking at some advanced stats, among draft-eligible FBS running backs with 100-plus rush attempts, that was a sample size of 76 here. Tuten received 183 rush attempts this year. He had 6.3 yards per attempt, which is tied for 8th in the sample size. That's impressive. His yak per attempt of 4.4 was 5th in the sample size. Very impressive. His breakaway run percentage of 54% was 4th in the sample size. His PFF rushing grade of 80.7 was 35th. I do agree that there are some issues to his game in terms of his rushing of the football, specifically with vision and just general run IQ and creativity in and of itself. His PFF receiving grade of 60.5 was 42nd in the sample size. I will agree that he isn't a premier receiving back, but he can get it done after the catch especially. His yards per out run of 0.42 were 67th. Once again, I didn't watch every game this season, so that's an astronomical amount of receptions for a limited amount of receiving yards. So that is quite strange, especially after 3 straight seasons of being relatively efficient with in terms of yards per reception. His elusiveness rating of 143.2 though is 3rd. He is pretty elusive, especially in the open field. In terms of his missed tackles forced, his 62 were 12th in the sample size, and that's 0.34 per attempt. His rushing yards and rushing yards per game of 104.5 on 16.6 attempts per game is pretty impressive. His 7.4 receiving yards per game on 2.1 receptions per game isn't very good, but once again, The prior 3 seasons, he was pretty efficient, and he had 17 total touchdowns this season. As far as his grading goes, remember that he's give or take 5'11", 209 pounds. I wouldn't be shocked if he doesn't quite weigh as much as that. He is a senior out of Virginia Tech. He transferred from NCA&T. My valuation, I think he's worthy of a 3rd-round pick. My comparison, I think he's a larger Devon Achane type of player. And so he has elite speed and acceleration as well as deceleration to maximize yardage in the open field. And he has a decent amount of wiggle as well, but he isn't quite the Devon Achane in the receiving game. He's really good after the catch, though. So if you take a poor angle or miss a tackle attempt on him, he could take any reception to the house as well. But his route tree isn't particularly great, and he does have inconsistent hands. And so in terms of my contact balance grade for him, I gave him a 4 out of 5. If he is able to get ahead of steam, he breaks tackles pretty easily, but he doesn't break multiple tackles in any individual run, really. He just is generally going to break one tackle if he's able to get ahead of steam, which for somebody his size and with his frame is pretty good in my opinion. But you're not going to confuse him with, say, Ashton Genty or Travion Henderson in that regard. In terms of his physicality, I gave him a 3.5 out of 5. He has no qualms about being a physical player. He will lower the shoulder and attempt to go through you. It's just not as effective given his frame. And so I really don't think he's going to be consistently dominating people with physicality at the NFL level. In terms of his vision, I gave him a 3 out of 5. I think it's generally better than average, but it is a little inconsistent in his ability to find cutback lanes, and I think he stretches things too far east and west horizontally for my liking. But once again, it isn't an overt deficiency to his game, which is going to prevent him from seeing work, in my opinion, especially given how impressive some of his strengths are. In terms of his ball security, remember that he had 9 collegiate fumbles in the past 2 seasons after having none in his first 2, albeit with limited usage in his first collegiate season. And so ball security is an issue. I saw multiple fumbles on film in the sample size of games watched. And so that is something that I think is going to need to be watched and monitored at the NFL level, especially given that I don't think he's going to receive elite draft capital to compensate if he does happen to have some of these fumbles that someone like, say, Ashton Genty might have, probably being, a 1st-round pick and, probably a first half of the 1st-round pick as well. And so in terms of his run IQ, I gave him a 3 out of 5, which is a little bit above average. He does miss cutback lanes, and he has this trait where when a hole isn't there, he tries to use his elite burst to just accelerate through a hole that sometimes doesn't exist. And so it happens a decent amount. And so while his vision isn't objectively poor per se, it's not really on par with some of these other running back prospects, but he's still an incredibly dangerous player. And so speaking of dangerous, I gave him a 9.5 out of 10 for speed. He's a projected low 4.3s. And so he is going to be able to take just about anything to the house. And so if you miss a tackle or you take a poor angle, or even if you have a decent angle and you're not really careful, this guy will house it on you and make you look stupid. In terms of acceleration, it's also elite. I have seen a little bit better, but it is quite good. And it really does work in tandem with his deceleration. He uses his acceleration and deceleration manipulatively to crush angles and take runs that most running backs couldn't dream of housing to the house rather consistently. It's just he needs a mistake to be made or good blocking generally to happen in order to access this speed and acceleration to be able to take things to the house. In terms of his agility and change of direction, when he's not accelerating really quickly, his change of direction and agility is above average in my opinion. It's just when he does get going at a max speed, he doesn't quite have some of the agility or change of direction that some high-end traitsy prospects do have while also being really fast and accelerating quickly. And so I think that they're both above average, but I don't consider them elite or particularly great per se. In terms of his catching, I gave him a 3 out of 5. I saw multiple drops on film, and they are littered throughout his stats on a per year basis. In terms of his route running, he was used on screens, wheels, and flats, but I really don't think that he has the ability per se to have an extensive route tree. Maybe he could surprise me, but once again, it's fine. It's pretty average in my opinion. In terms of his run after catch, it is quite good. If you make a mistake with the angle in which you take, or if he's able to break a tackle with speed to power, which his speed to power is quite good. It's just that the overt power, when he doesn't have the inertia working on his side, isn't that great. But once again, if you miss, he could take anything to the house, and he is quite good after the catch, especially at utilizing blocking. In terms of his pass protection, he is a very willing blocker. I would like to see him square up a little bit better, and he just isn't going to have the best anchor given that he isn't the biggest guy. And so I really don't think that's ever going to be an overt strength of his, but I've definitely seen worse, and it has nothing to do with his lack of willingness to be a good blocker in pass protection. In terms of his dog factor, I gave him a 4.5 out of 5. He seeks contact, he tries to lower the shoulder, and when he does get speed, he does have the speed to power element to his game, but he needs to be able to accelerate first and get that initial burst to really be able to display it. And so while he is a relatively aggressive player, he just doesn't have the frame to consistently break multiple tackles in any individual run at the NFL level, in my opinion. And so I still gave him a pretty good score, though. In terms of his analytics, he had 2 1,100 plus yard rushing seasons, 3 straight seasons from his sophomore to senior season with at least 10 rushing touchdowns, and he had over 195 receiving yards in 3 of 4 collegiate seasons. And so that's a relatively good production profile, although it wasn't the progressive growth that we would potentially like. And he didn't have any true dominant Heisman level production season. And so I still gave him a 4 out of 5, though. It's pretty good production, honestly. In terms of his projected draft capital, he is supposed to be a 5th round pick per NFL Draft Buzz. That's the site, by the way, that I use for all of these projected draft capital metrics for any prospect at all. And so that's a 2 out of 5, not particularly great, and it really isn't a significant team investment. So his fumbling issue, if it follows him to the NFL level, could really hurt him. But once again, his game-breaking ability is probably going to translate. And as far as his creativity, I gave him a 3.5 out of 5. It's slightly above average. Once again, he does miss cutback lanes from time to time, and he tries to extend things horizontally a little bit too much for my liking at times. Sometimes he just needs to take what's given for him. But once again, if he is able to exploit the defense and get a good bit of burst in terms of acceleration in a straight line, he is able to shatter angles, and he is going to take a lot of runs to the house that most running backs couldn't dream of doing. And so as far as my potential worries / limitations, he does have a little bit of an injury history, and he doesn't have the best build. And so I just, with somebody that's not the biggest framed guy, it's probably going to be an issue, to be honest with you. And he might not be a 3-down player due to a lack of ability in pass protection. Once again, he's willing. I would like to see him square up a little bit better to identify pass rushers. I did see him miss a couple of assignments, and he just doesn't have the frame and anchor necessary to really be dominant there. And I think most teams, to be honest with you, are probably going to have a better back and pass protection to utilize. But after the catch, for instance, once again, he is very good. And so overall, I am thoroughly impressed with him as a player, and I give him a 72.5 out of 100. And so where does Tuten rank among his contemporaries in 2025, as well as the 24 class stacked on top of each other? Well, I have Genty and Henderson kind of at the top of the great tier of running back prospects, then James and Hampton at the bottom of that same tier. Then in the good tier of running backs, I have Judkins, Johnson in this class, Trey Benson from 2024. Then I have Tuten slightly below Benson. Then we have Jonathan Brooks and Jalen Wright. And so with Tuten, I think he's a good running back prospect once again. There are some things in terms of just his physicality and some of his vision and decision-making that are keeping him from being one of the great running back prospects, in my opinion. But I still think he's among good company, and it makes sense in my opinion. And remember that he's give or take 5'11", 209 pounds, and so he isn't the biggest guy, and he's probably going to be worthy of a 3rd-round pick, in my opinion. My comp for him, he's a larger Devon Achane type of player. And so what I mean by this is he has elite speed and acceleration. He does struggle with vision sometimes, but he's just not quite the receiver that Devon Achane is. But just like with Achane, he is incredibly dangerous after the catch due to his elite speed and acceleration. And once again, my official grade for him is a 72.5 out of 100, which is a good running back prospect. And I want to give a special shout out to my Patreon members. Thank you to Big Hunt, SP, Major Jack, and Infamy MTG. If you would like to become a member, I'm going to leave a link in the comment section. As far as what you'll gain, you'll get access to a private Discord server. I'm going to have a real life and fantasy football chat where we talk about real life NFL news. Any questions you might have will be answered in the real life NFL chat. And as far as the fantasy football chat, we'll talk about what's happening in the fantasy world. I'll give you team reviews, give you optimal roster construction based on your specific league settings, trades you can make to strengthen your roster, buying and selling points, specifically price points for various players based on your positions of need. I'll give you a special shout out, obviously, on all of these videos. You'll get early access to videos. You'll be part of private live streams that are not available to regular YouTube members. And you will also have the ability to suggest videos specifically for you on Patreon. I've already made one on Isaac Rendo as per request by one of my Patreon members. And so once again, if you would like to join, the link is going to be in the comment section. Thanks.